So, hello, folks, and welcome to another GrowCFO webinar. Really excited about this one. I got Dan Schonfeld with us, and we're going to be talking about CFOs winning in the boardroom. But I'm going to give folk a few minutes just to get into the room properly, let one or two of the stragglers turn up. Just interested today, where are we all tuning in from? Do you mind just popping in the chat where you're from so we can get an idea of what the audience is like today? Oh, Ireland straight away. Declan, thank you. Anna's in Toronto, Flagstaff, Bristol, UK, Los Angeles, another Ireland, Nottingham, Newcastle. Why, I'm Newcastle here as well. Austria, Salzburg, Maidenhead near Windsor Castle, Denmark, Phoenix. Yeah, hey, we've got a global audience here, Dan. So, uh,
Excellent.
without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Dan to us. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this masterclass. I think we've got a really interesting topic here. Beyond the numbers, CFOs winning in the boardroom. Now, Dan is the CFO of one of our tech partners, ApprovalMax. But Dan, can you introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Absolutely, Kevin. And hi, everyone, and pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. By way of background, I've had a bit of a varied career. I've actually started out as a lawyer, a criminal prosecutor of all things. Then I spent about a decade or so in management consulting with the likes of McKinsey and UI and others. And then another few years in private equity, running an impact investment fund, operating primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. And then from that, I gravitated towards more operational and finance roles, got my accounting certification relatively late, as I'm sure you've noticed. And over the last few years, I've been focused exclusively on CFO and FD or finance director roles in tech companies, specifically SaaS companies.
So, Dan, you got that role, that qualification late. How much of that qualification do you find you actually need to do the CFO role?
Well, I think it is very, very helpful in understanding the numbers that you are reporting and also how they are perceived and how they're sort of digested by your target audience. So I definitely think that there's a very important layer to or sort of foundation. But I think that equally there are a lot of experiences that I bring from my more sort of operational and investment background to the role that I do, which complement and enhance the pure accounting perspective on things. So I think ultimately it blends really well.
Brilliant, brilliant. We're going to get into the real meat of things in a moment. But just to give us a little bit of context, I'm going to launch a poll and ask you folks which part of board reporting, working with the board, do you find most challenging? I'll just give you a couple of minutes to answer that. I'm guessing what the result's going to be on here, Dan. And yeah, give folk a few more minutes. Yeah.
Very, very interesting options in the answers.
Yes, yes, yes. And I'm actually right. The one that's coming out as the one folk are finding most difficult is exactly what I'd have thought it would be. Okay, so in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, poll closed. And I'm going to share those results, Dan. Turning data into a compelling story. 32% now. We talk so often about storytelling and how it's one of the biggest skills a CFO's got to have. And there it is coming out as the biggest challenge that everybody's got. But linking financials to strategy is still there, getting decisions or actions from the discussion. So turning that decision into something that people do. Yeah. Yeah. Any thoughts on those results?
Yeah, I think it's, as I said, a good blend of challenges that you typically find in interactions with the board. The one that came out on top, turning data into a compelling story. I mean, this is exactly where having previous background as a management consultant helps, because when you work in that industry, they drill into you how to build storylines and how to create effective presentations, and that is, I think, a very, very useful skill set to have as a CFO, because it helps you build a narrative around numbers.
Mm. Yeah. And coming from the same as management consulting background as yourself, Dan, I can absolutely echo that. And that is one of the things that I'm ever grateful for PwC and the likes teaching me is how to present and how to engage the client. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the good news is you don't need to be an ex-management consultant to learn that. I mean, those are skills that can be relatively easily picked up by anyone if you put in the effort.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely agree. But moving into the detail a little bit, Dan. Um, Boards don't want controllers who report or strategists who theorize. It's CFOs who do both. So, how do you balance being the financial conscious of the business with being a strategic driver?
I would say that it's not a question of balancing, because I don't see these as contradicting. I completely agree with you that boards don't want just people who spew strategic theory at them. At the same time, they don't want people who just come up with the numbers. They want both. But it's not about balancing. To me, it's about combining them effectively, because at the end of the day, a good story in a business context is one that's supported by facts. And facts become a lot more meaningful and useful and interesting if they are accompanied by a story or a narrative that explains them and puts them in context. So it is really about weaving the two together rather than creating a balance between two opposing forces.
Mm. Oh, by the way, folks, please ask questions in the Q&A and in the chat as we go along. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible rather than just Dan and I having a chat. Please join in with questions where appropriate. But Dan, what signals tell you that the board is seeing you as a business partner rather than score?
I think to me, it comes down really to mainly to the type of interactions and conversations you have with the board, the type of questions you get. If the discourse is limited to just you providing information, the board asking the questions about that information, making sure that it's clear and understood, and that's the extent of it, then I think there's a very important layer of value that's missing there. And I think you will truly become a business partner to the board if you can get to a point where you are discussing not just the numbers, but the why behind the numbers. Why are the numbers the way they are? What's driving that? What's influencing that? What do you do about it? So, the broader drivers and business context underlying and influencing the numbers.
Hmm. Yeah. So when did you last have pushback from the board? What
Sorry,
did
say again.
Sorry. When did you last have pushback from your board?
Uh, well, as I'm sure you are all aware, it is budget season.
Yes, been there, done that, got the t-shirt.
Yeah, so and the answer to that would not, my answer to that would therefore not be when was, but actually when is. We're currently going through that with our board, and as I'm sure all of you have experienced in the past, it is, or it does tend to be, a very iterative process where you come up with something and it doesn't necessarily fly the first time around, and then you get into these feedback loops of you present something, the board pushes back and says, no, this is not good enough, growth is not high enough, or costs are too high, you're not striking the right balance between growth and efficiency, and so on. So there's the usual inevitable horse trading that goes on.
Yeah. Now, I'm a little bit of a cynic about that, having been through that process of preparing budgets. And back in ICI years ago, I was European business accountant for their plastics business. So we had our board for the business, first point of approval. Then our board went up to Chemicals and Polymers Group, who had their input, and then their budget went up to main board, who had their input. And at each level, there'd be pushback. And all the time, it would be profits not good enough, sales aren't good enough. And we'd build in all these adjustments. But come January month end, there was always a variance. And the variance, had we gone with the budget we first thought of, would have been a lot smaller. It always makes me very, very cynical. I mean, do you find there's that pressure to put numbers that in there that perhaps aren't realistic?
It's a very good question, and I think there isn't. I at least don't have a general answer to it. I think it does very much depend on the type of organization you're in and the type of board you have. I have almost exclusively been working with scale ups, so effectively high growth tech organizations that don't tend to have these multiple layers of approvals that you've described. They're less, let's say, structured or bureaucratic than that. And even then, sometimes you get boards that play the game the way you just described it, and then yes, of course, you sandbag. You say, yeah, they're going to push us down no matter what we do, so let's go in with numbers that are higher to compensate, and you sort of expect the horse trading. But sometimes, and especially in the current situation, I've been fortunate enough to be working with a really professional board that look at things on merits, and there's less games. And so if you come and present something and you do a good job of explaining why it is the way it is, they won't push back on it just for the sake of pushing back on it. They will challenge where appropriate, but they'll also accept where needed. And I think this is a privilege that we have at ApprovalMax.
Yeah. So Marcus is asking a question that says, if you feel strongly about a certain plan or direction, but can't get buy-in from the board, at what point do you agree to disagree?
That's a difficult one. This is the sort of pick your battles type situation. Um, what I try to do in situations like that is manage not just me personally, but sort of as a management team, manage political capital very, very carefully. Because, at the end of the day, the board will give a lot of weight to what the management team says. However, if you continuously argue with them, you run out of ammunition at some point. So this is really about picking the right things to insist on. And in my experience, if you don't sort of counter or get into a friction situation with the board too often, when you do, as a management team, feel that it is very important, and you sort of firmly but gently put your foot down and say, no, no, this we think is really, really important for the company, they would not tend to completely ignore your view, because again, they would be taking, as a board, they would be taking a very significant risk in doing so.
Hmm.
So it comes down to just picking the right battles.
Yeah. But you're seeing this from two sides, aren't you? You're working both as a CFO, working with the management team and reporting into the board, but you're also a board member in other organizations. How does seeing both sides of this affect you?
Well, it's incredibly valuable. I mean, I am, as you correctly mentioned, on the board of several earlier stage tech companies just by virtue of having invested in them. And being able to see that perspective is incredibly helpful to me when it comes to doing the work of a CFO, because it's easier for me to try and sort of channel my inner board member and say, okay, if I was a board member in a situation like that and I was presented with this information and with this argument or with this line of reasoning, what would I think about it? How would I react to it? And it just helps sort of bulletproof your storylining, your analysis, your presentation, and the way you approach the whole discussion with the board.
Hmm. Which kind of brings us into the second po- area I want to talk to you about. Now we saw how important storytelling was and how much of a challenge folk find it is in the poll. So let's talk a little bit about shaping the narrative, because boards don't want every detail. They want to understand what's next and why it matters, don't they? So how do you link your numbers to the strategic context?
Well, that again, to a large extent, depends on the kind of board you have, because in some cases, the board will help you do that. And what I mean by that is, for example, very often you find if you're dealing with boards that have VCs or private equity representatives on them, they will ask for specific types of information and specific types of analysis, which help you tie in the numbers, the sort of the financials of the business to its performance and operation on key aspects. And in that sense, they'll help you create that linkage. That at the end of the day, that is really what matters, because there's no end to the breadth and width of numbers that you can present about any business to a board. And it's very easy to get lost in the numbers. There's so much data. You can look at it 15,000 different ways, right? But in any business, there are some perspectives, some aspects, some metrics or KPIs that are the ones that really truly capture in the best way the value drivers of that business. And the trick is to figure out what those are, and then focus your attention, management's attention, the board's attention on these core numbers.
Mm. Those numbers, sometimes it's not the good news story that everybody wants it to be. Now, how do you go then and frame those perhaps not quite so good numbers honestly and in a way you can have a serious discussion with the board?
Yeah, those are not pleasant situations. My approach to these situations has always been, I mean, first and foremost, you need to deliver bad news early. The longer you wait, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
So if you understand that something's going off, put it up on the table in the open, talk about it. Don't hide it. Don't kick the can down the road. Don't, put your hand in the sand and say, yeah, maybe it'll solve itself in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Very likely it won't, and it'll just get worse, right? So you need to be courageous with these things. One. Second, I think it's important to be upfront, not just deliver the bad news, but also understand why it happened. So not just the facts, but also the reasons behind the facts. Take the blame when necessary. And if it's something to do with, obviously it's something to do with the organization, but it's also, if say it's something to do with you personally, put your hand up and say, I got this wrong, and I'm aware that I got this wrong, and I'm not hiding from that. And then most importantly, be very clear and very concrete about how you're going to fix this. As in, if it's fixable, fine. If it's not fixable, how are we going to avoid this happening again? What are the lessons learned? What is going to be different tomorrow because this has happened? And if you do that, and then you follow up on that, and actually does get addressed, then I think you win a lot of credibility, both because you've come and spoken about it openly and honestly, but also because you followed up and taken the necessary steps.
Do you find that for these sorts of discussions, it's worth talking to people outside of the boardroom before the meeting?
Absolutely. And many years ago, I used to work for UBS as part of the in-house consulting team that they had there. And one of my bosses there was a former partner at McKinsey. And one of the best lessons she's ever taught me was never walk into a board meeting or like a senior group setting. That UBS, it was the executive committee, right? Never walk into that situation without having spoken to each of the people in the room previously, privately, prepared them for the discussion, syndicated it with them, and have had their response and feedback. Because even if they're going to resist, and even if they're going to go against it, and even if they're going to not agree with you, at least they know, sorry, where they're coming from, the fact that they don't like it, and also why they don't like it, and then you can be prepared for that. So her recommendation was, if you do your job well, the actual meeting is basically a foregone conclusion. You know exactly what's going to happen.
Mm. I guess that goes for just about anything you might be putting towards the board. If you've got an investment proposal, it's probably very useful to take that same tack and get everybody's view.
Yeah,
So that when
absolutely. And you also want to run them through, as appropriate, of course, you want to run them through your thinking process. So to allow them to provide input and integrate as much of that input into your work so they also feel that they've influenced. It creates a sense of ownership.
yeah, yeah. So what do you see the biggest mistakes that CFOs are making in board reporting?
I think there are two main ones that I would point to. One is, and I think I touched on that a little bit earlier, which is you just present facts,
Mm,
but there's no story, there's no narrative, there's no analysis, there's no so what, there's no insight. It's just, okay, let me tell you what the numbers are. I've told you what the numbers are. I've done my job. Let's move on to the next thing. It's just, you're just missing an opportunity to be part of the conversation and have more ability to influence it. And the other thing is related to a dichotomy that I like to have in mind about our profession, which is what I call archaeology versus astrology. A lot of CFOs or FDs tend to focus on what I call archaeology, which is reporting the past, what has happened, what the results are. And yes, that is the core of the, no question, that is the foundation of the profession. But if you just leave it at that and you don't talk about the future and then basically just say, okay, so let's take the context of what has happened to date and then let's talk about what's going to happen in the future, what needs to change, needs to be done, so on. Again, you are missing a very significant part of your role, in my view.
mm, yeah. Yeah, I'm minded as we're talking about this too. You said you learned a lot from days in consulting. I remember one key lesson I learned from a PwC partner when we were going into the client together. I prepared the material to present and we were reviewing it before the meeting, and it was, Kevin, just simple three rules. What do we need them to know? How do we want them to feel? What do we want them to do? And that three-step thing has been just so great a piece of learning for me. And I'm sort of coming back to what we're talking about here, that we've got to turn that story into some sort of action from people. And do you have any practical insight on kind of turning the story into making sure people take action?
Yeah, I mean, I really love the framework, and I think it's a very, very good way to think. I would actually dare to add a fourth question to his list of three questions, and that is, who are we talking to? As in, not just the group, the context, and so on, but more often than not, you're walking into a room, you're talking to a group of people, but there's actually one or two people in there that are the real important people. They are the ones that drive the decision. They either because they're more senior or more experienced, or just because of virtue of their personality, they're more dominant, right? So you may be talking to a group of, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 people, but you need to figure out who are the one or two people that really matter in that setting and focus on them, because you know that if you've identified them correctly and if you've tailored your communication to them, they will carry the rest of the room for you.
That's an interesting. That echoes something that I teach in one of the modules of our future CFO program. The last module there is, you know, how to excel in your first 100 days in your new CFO role. And I always point out to people that one of the challenges of moving into a new organization is there'll always be somebody in that boardroom or in whatever management team it is you're part of that will have that will be first among equals, that'll have just a little bit more of the CFO, the CEO's ear than other people around the table. I really think one of the first things you've got to do when you're new into a role, whatever that committee structure might be, is work out who's that first among equals.
Yeah, completely agreed.
Yeah, but great CFOs don't just survive board meetings, they shape them. So, you're going to get some pretty tough questions thrown at you, Dan. How do you go about preparing for those sorts of questions as the board meeting's coming up? And must even be some that you can't fully answer.
Well, I think it really depends on the situation, and let's be honest. I mean, you can and you will find yourself in situations where you are being asked very tough questions and you can't really address them. And I think the first thing I would say is you need to be comfortable with saying I don't know, which very few people are comfortable with. And obviously, if you don't know something that you're supposed to know, it's embarrassing, right? But you shouldn't walk into a situation like that feeling that you're expected to know anything and everything about everything. I mean, it's just impractical, right? And I think there is a lot of credibility, and I would say even humility, to being able to say, you know what, that's a very good question. I'm not fully prepared to answer it right now. Let me take that away, research it and analyze it properly, and come back to you with a qualified answer rather than just trying to, pull something out of my ear right now. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that increasingly CFOs are looked to discuss, explain, analyze, and sort of narrate all of the business, not just the financial side of the business. And your ability as a CFO to do that depends critically on the relationships that you build with your peers. And if you don't have good, open, honest, trusting relationships with your peers in the management team, and you really use that to understand what's happening in other areas of the business which are not necessarily under your direct remit, you will find yourself in a position where you are being asked these difficult questions and you are expected to know how to answer them, and you just have no idea because you're not communicating well enough with your colleagues. And that's something that I think CFOs need to work proactively at.
Any tips on how to do that?
One thing that I do is establish a regular cadence of touch points with all of my peers. So basically, pretty much the first thing I do when I get into a role like that is say, okay, let's go around the houses, meet everyone one-on-one, and then just decide together whether we should touch base weekly, bi-weekly, maybe twice a week, depending on the level of frequency, right? And then you turn that into a habit, and you make sure that these conversations add value not just to you but also to the other side, and you just build a rapport and you build a habit of open, honest communication. You bring things to these discussions which are not necessarily always comfortable to talk about, or it can't just be polite chit chat, right? And sometimes these discussions are difficult, and sometimes they're charged, but they always have to be constructive, and they always have to be, friendly and amicable, and with the aim to build something together. And over time, that creates a really strong foundation of open communications.
A lot of us are working remotely these days, or we're working with organizations that got people scattered over the globe. Now, how do you find that not being able to have the chat over the coffee machine impacts on what you're doing here?
It does. I mean, this is probably by the way, we're the same. I mean, we're spread out over multiple countries. I work out of London. Nowadays, most of the management team is London based, but not all of it, for example. And even then, I mostly work from home and we meet in the office once a week. So I completely relate to what you're saying. And it does exact a very significant price. I think, and don't get me wrong, I also see quite a lot of benefits in working remotely. So, I've never managed to make up my mind on which of the two I prefer, to be honest. But to answer your question more directly, I think you need to be aware of the fact that it does exact a price. There are no coffee machine chats. There are no water cooler chats. Nobody drops by your desk and start talking about this, that, or the other. And the way I try to compensate for that is exactly through those scheduled, periodic, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever interactions where, sometimes you run out of time and you're just talking about the business. And sometimes you spend half an hour talking about, I don't know, politics, football, whatever, kids, family. And this just, you try to compensate. It's not a full compensation to be sure, but you can go quite a long ways in creating a sort of informal atmosphere of connection and exchange.
Yeah, I certainly get that one about talking football, family, whatever it is. I My mind goes back there to a client that I had once working in Saudi Arabia with a client. The client was expat, and I knew if I wanted to get any work done with this particular client, I had to spend half an hour talking about Manchester United before we did anything, which is always very difficult for a staunch Newcastle United fan. But hey, I think you've got to know what makes people tick.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And as a Liverpool fan, I would probably find that situation even more challenging than you. But yeah, ironically, I just came off a call with a very important vendor of ours, and as always, half of the call was spent on football because he's a gunner.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Oh well, we normally I'd have sympathy, but this season they're doing a little bit too well. Yeah. Um. Yeah. So you're in that boardroom. Okay. We've talked about the getting to know people well. We've talked about the discussions outside of the boardroom, but you're in there. The discussion's going along. Now, how, how do you find your ability to read the room and know when to let a discussion run and when to force it along?
Sorry, I lost the mute button there for a second. It is critical. And by the way, to your earlier point, this is also a huge difference to me between in-person board meetings and virtual board meetings. You lose so much of that when you go virtual. I mean, body language, posture, and so on. I mean, screen is a rather flat medium, so it becomes a lot more difficult. But it is critical to observe these things and note them. And I think one thing that is important to do is to basically just continuously gather intel when other people are talking, because it's very, very difficult to do that when you're talking, especially since you're talking, you usually are looking at one person and there's several people in the room, right? So I think it's very important that, typically in a board situation, you wouldn't be the only one talking all of the time, hopefully at least. And so when somebody else is talking, rather than, some people just, I don't know, check emails on their phone or open a laptop or whatever, or try to think about the next thing they want to say and so on. I think it's very useful to sort of scan the room, look at the people, try to read them, their temperature, their body language. Are they engaged? Are they not? Are they, positive, enthusiastic, or are they sort of holding back and rigid and sort of against things? What's the energy, right? And that helps you to do two things. First of all, calibrate your level of energy and enthusiasm in the way you present things, but also, again, back to the earlier point, who am I talking to? Because if I identify that there's somebody who is the main sort of objectionist to what we're discussing right now, maybe it would be a good idea to focus most of my attention on that person and try to get them over the line, just to create the right kind of momentum.
Mm. So Declan is asking question. Yeah. You recall an instance earlier in my career where the CFO screamed at me for making a forward-looking statement in the management pack that provided context around the sales performance and why we felt the adverse performance to date was going to be okay and just a timing issue. I had that visibility, but I was swiftly chastised for it. Safe to say I didn't listen to that advice. Yeah.
Good,
So
good.
more of an observation than a statement. Thank you, Declan. I think that's very true. Don't
Yeah,
always uh, accept the advice that's given to you. There's a lot to be said for going with your gut. Mm.
true. I think some of it's also perhaps a generational thing, because to be fair, that I think piece of feedback, which by the sounds of it wasn't delivered very pleasantly, uh, perhaps represents a more sort of legacy view of the CFO role than is the case today. So I think there's been quite a lot of evolution and expansion of that, the sort of understanding of that role. And maybe this is the old way of looking at things.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting question coming in from Veronica. And we need to chastise ourselves for talking about football here, Dan. But how do you bridge the male small talk being dominated by sport? As a female FD, I feel on the outside if I don't show interest in sport that the male boardroom likes to use as an icebreaker in meetings. That is an excellent point, Veronica.
It is. It is, and it is also a challenge, definitely. I The only thing I can contribute on that is just to say that as an example, my wife was uh, an innovation consultant and works quite a lot with boards and similar levels of seniority, finds herself in that situation quite often, and she's not a sports fan at all. And the way she deals with it, and does seem to work quite well for her, is instead of trying to either completely stay out of the conversation, which obviously leaves her at a disadvantage, or try to engage in a conversation about something that she doesn't really know a hell of a lot about, she uses her experiences of me as a sports fan to basically get involved in the situation. So she's not really talking about herself because she doesn't know about that, but she's rather sort of using anecdotes from her experiences of me as a sports fan. And that way she has something to contribute to the conversation while still staying on sort of safe grounds, because she doesn't need to know anything about sports. She just needs to know me.
Yeah.
So perhaps that's a possible way of dealing with that.
Yeah, I'd also add to that is that that emphasizes why you need to know the people around that board table very well, because that sort of sports conversation, I think, is a very high level thing that probably gets engaged with because they know it's an easy starting point. But if you know those people around the board table very well, you'll know there are other things that will spark interest in those individuals, other conversations you can strike up. And sport isn't necessarily all male thing. There are many, many males around the board who won't have that liking for sport. I remember my own father-in-law. If I tried striking up a conversation with him about anything sport related, I was onto a total loser. So,
Mm.
you've got to know individuals. Uh, I don't think it's a gender thing at all. It's an individual thing. And find out, what is it that people are passionate about? What illuminates them? What are the things you can talk about? Yeah.
Yeah. And one angle that I've found works quite well usually is non-profit charities, specific interests, and so on. Again, to your point, doing your research, knowing the people. A lot of times you will find that board members have a particular cause that's close to their heart, and then they will always be open to a discussion around that. And if you show interest in that, that will give you common ground. And that's very useful to have.
Yeah. And Amit is saying, I do that all the time. I use my son as my sports proxy, which is great. Alice is saying, I found family matters can be helpful. Talks of children looking for schools, etc. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Chats about family and kids and so on, always very, very useful in the boardroom, in the management team. Yeah.
Yeah, just avoid politics.
Oh, definitely. Yes. Yes. That's a very dangerous hole to go down. And I've got odd experiences of that. If you go down that hole of it taking over an entire meeting, you never get around to the proper business. Yeah. But I suppose all of this fits into that sort of earning confidence in the boardroom because I think boards judge CFOs by what they, not by what they report, but how they respond. So, you know, we've touched already on bad news, but on a personal level, how do you stay credible if you're delivering bad news?
I think it goes back to what we discussed earlier, which is, so bad news is bad news. Nobody likes bad news. They will always respond negatively to it. But bad news begs the question of what are you going to do about it?
Mm,
And if you come into the room having thought that through, so I mean, my my CEO uses a very useful framework to talk about these things. He calls it sort of four levels of leadership, right? Well, level one is basically say, okay, there's a problem, and you leave it at that. Level two is there's a problem, and here are some solutions. Level three is there's a problem, here are some solutions, and this is the solution I think that we should implement. And level four is there's a problem, and this is the solution I've already chosen, and it's already being actioned.
Mm.
And boards appreciate, if you at least go to level three, if not level four. You need to be proactive about it, not just, oh, bad news, oh my God, what am I going to do? Run around like a headless chicken. No, this happened. This is why it's happened. This is what we're going to do about it. And this is why it's never going to happen again. And
Yeah.
you, dear board, can rest assured that, matters are dealt with. And we're a safe pair of hands as a management group.
Mm.
And we're not hiding it, but we've definitely taken action and learned from it. That's how you maintain credibility, by dealing with the problem.
And you're being quite decisive doing that, but is there not a risk that you'd come across as being a bit rigid in that sort of approach if you're being very
Well,
decisive?
I think it depends. I mean, it's a fair comment. I think it depends on two things mainly. One is the nature of the problem. The other one is the type of board you have. Boards at the end of the day are people, and people vary in many things, and including in their level of how involved in the details they want to be, and how much command and control they are in their nature. So some boards would want to be involved in the decision making on more things and have things brought to them for deliberation and decision, rather than the management team saying there was a problem, we've dealt with it, this is what we've done. Other boards would be more enabling and more trusting in the management team to basically deal with things, and just be on sort of the receiving end of the update of that. And again, also depends on the nature of the matter at hand. The more risky it is, the more complicated it is, the more strategic it is, the more you would tend to not go ahead and do things and then only then report them to the board, but rather come to the board for a discussion. Either way, you should never leave it at level one or level two, as in, here's the problem, or here's the problem, and here are some potential solutions, and then just leave it at that. You need to think it through. You need to be proactive. You need to say, okay, this is what I'd suggest we do, and here are the reasons why.
Yeah. And I think there's something about I suggest we do versus here's what we've got to do. So at least if you're saying suggest, it gives that opportunity for a little bit of feedback. Even if you've pretty much decided this is what we're going to do, it does at least give the opportunity for others to have their input into the conversation and feel included. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and on that, by the way, going back to an earlier point, again, the working premise here is that before you've come to the board to discuss that formally, you've already sounded out each of the different board members about that specific situation. You've discussed it through with them. They know what the situation is. They know what the problem is, and you know that they're comfortable with your proposed line of solution. So again, ideally, this is pre-syndicated.
Mm. So, Dan, we've mentioned on a number of occasions the need to be prepared, the need to have those conversations before the board meeting, the need to think things through to get to the stage of this is why it's happened, this is what we're going to do about it. Those aren't things you do with your nose stuck in an Excel spreadsheet, for example. Now, how do you find time to do all the strategic stuff when there's all of the day-to-day going on in the business?
Well, this is the short answer to that question is team.
Yeah.
You need a really good, strong team, and you need a really well-balanced team as well. It doesn't have to be huge, it shouldn't be, but it needs to be high caliber, it needs to be professional, it needs to be hardworking, and it needs to be well-balanced in terms of what the team is capable of doing, because different people will have different areas of strength, and you need to create the right balance in the team so that you have all of your bases covered. And most importantly, you need to trust them. You need to trust them. You need to enable them to do things on their own. And that also means you need to let them understand that it is perfectly acceptable to make mistakes, because the only person that doesn't make a mistake is the person that doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
and you need to have their back when they make mistakes. So if something bad happens, yes, it's your fault, and you take the blame for it, and you have a conversation with the person, and you figure out what went wrong, and you figure out how to fix it. But you never throw them under the bus. You know, vis-a-vis that person is between you and them, right? But vis-a-vis anyone else, it's on you because you're the CFO and it's your department and it's your responsibility. And when you build that kind of a high-performing team, they take care of most of the stuff for you. And if you've built it well and trained them well, you know that it's a delivery at good quality. That gives you a lot of spare time to do other things, which is all of the things that we've been talking about so far, which are time consuming, to be fair.
Yeah. Do you have any particular tactics to make space in your week to do the forward-looking stuff?
Yeah, like a lot of things, I basically rely on technology. I have a very useful app that I've integrated with my schedule, which proactively goes out and blocks significant parts of my schedule as focus time, and that allows me to basically just have spare time to do things that are not planned for and always exist. Because if you don't do that, I found your schedule just fills up, from morning to evening, completely blocked, and then you don't have time to think. And if you're not thinking, you're not doing your job. So that little piece of technology has helped me quite a lot.
Yeah, and I've tried something very similar, and I find my diary can quite easily get full up with podcast recordings, conversations with tech partners, all sorts of things. And generally, I schedule stuff using a diary app. So I've made sure that I've got various priorities of meeting types in there. There's a VIP meeting that, if it's something important, can get scheduled anytime. But the scheduling slots for the more routine conversations and the podcast recordings, you know, I've definitely protected large chunks of my diary so that I'm not constantly just talking to people. I can actually get some stuff done.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd say to anybody, control your diary proactively, manage time.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
I find,
Otherwise, other people will do it for you.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that takes into a broader conversation there, Dan. How are you using AI?
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, the topic of the hour. Um, so, I mean, let me answer that at two levels, at the sort of company level and at the finance level. At the company level, we are putting a lot of effort into integrating AI into our products to make it better, more efficient, more effective, and basically just proactively come up with ways for people to run their accounts payable through our product in a way that is both safer and more effective. So we see this as a very, very significant area of focus for us, and we're putting quite a lot of emphasis into that. Within the finance function specifically, I think the answer is a little bit more nuanced. We have and continue to put a lot of effort into identifying potentially useful AI solutions for our work. I have to say that for the most part to date, I've been rather disappointed by the results. We use generic AI, so ChatGPT, Claude, and so on, to great effect. We do. It helps in great many things, especially around strategy, analysis, and so on. But these are generic solutions. You can train them, and you should train them. You should personalize them. You get much better results. I mean, my team and I have put in a lot of effort into doing that. But they're still generic solutions. We have, over the last few months, experimented with probably at least 20 different sort of allegedly AI-powered specific finance applications. And I say allegedly because in some cases you find that it just has a kind of an AI sticker on it, but it's not really that. And in other cases, what we found is that the use case is very limited, or the value added is not very significant compared to what we already have in place. And so we haven't really found anything that I can point to and say, wow, that's a game changer. I'm still hopeful. I think it's a question of time. It will happen. But so far, I've been somewhat underwhelmed.
Yeah. But a product like ApprovalMax, and that's directly contributing to the finance team, automating things, saving time. And how, how much benefit do you think a CFO is going to get in terms of creating strategic headroom using products like ApprovalMax?
Oh, loads. I mean, look, at the end of the day, one of the key things, and I know it's kind of sounds obvious, but one of the really key things, so almost table stakes when you're dealing with a board, is that the quality of the data you bring to the table has to be immaculate.
Yeah,
Really. I mean, there's absolutely no tolerance for soft data, right? Now, the quality of this is garbage in, garbage out. The quality of the data you bring to the board is the quality of the data that you have input in your systems. And when that data is generated through a very robust approval system like ApprovalMax, which has multiple points of control, and you have a very comprehensive audit trail, and you know exactly what happened at each point in time in the journey of anything that relates to money out, as we call it, from the point in time where the original requirement for something to be paid has come in, all the way to the actual payment, and everything in between is very clear, very documented, very structured, very robust. Then there's zero doubt regarding the reliability and veracity of that data, and that puts you in a very different place when discussing anything with the board, because there's no question in anyone's mind that the numbers you're presenting are correct.
mm,
That, I think, is it's I can't overstate how powerful that is.
yeah. Do you find that that tool helps you with managing cost as well as approving cost?
Absolutely. I mean, it gives us amazing visibility on who paid who, when, and for what, and how much. And then taking all of that, it's a treasure trove of data, right? Taking all of that data and then analyzing it to understand patterns. It first of all, I mean, simple things like budget versus actuals, right? It just makes it so much easier to run that. You know in almost real time whether you are close to or above your budget threshold and so on. But also, more fundamentally, it allows you to understand trends. For example, spend with specific vendors or in specific areas or on very specific activities, whether that's going up or down. And if it's trending in a certain direction, is that in line with what you'd expect as a business? For example, let's take marketing. Marketing is an obvious case, right? And you can see that you're spending more and more on certain types of activities in marketing. You would expect that to also translate into a more rapid growth in customer acquisition. If that doesn't happen, that allows you to raise the question of, hang on, we're spending more and more on this stuff. Is it justified? And that allows you as a CFO to really become a valuable partner in that conversation, not just reporting, this is what we spend on this type of activity, but rather ask the next question, which is, this is what we spend, this is what the result is. Does this make sense?
Mm, okay. We've covered a lot of ground here today, Dan, and thank you hugely for doing that. And I'd like to invite anybody who has got any more questions for Dan to please put them either in the chat or in the Q&A. And we've got the last 5 or so minutes that we can talk about that. I'm going to put a poll up. We've briefly talked about ApprovalMax. That wasn't the purpose of today's webinar to go into ApprovalMax in any sort of detail, but no, we've talked about it. Do you want to know any more about it? I'm more than happy to for somebody in Dan's organization to get back to you if you want to find out more. But Dan, as we wrap up, you know, what are the three takeaways from today that you would leave for every CFO?
Well, I think the first is you need to really think about your role as, to some extent, or to a very large extent, as the key interface between the management of the company and the board, a translator or facilitator, if you will. At the end of the day, boards respond to numbers, and you are the owner of the primary numbers of the business. And so, in that sense, you are a conduit, and you're a very important conduit, and you shape the conversation. So, understand that, realize that, own that, take responsibility of that, leverage that. This is a big part of what you do. Uh, Related to that, you need to really get a very firm understanding of what the value drivers underlying your business are so that you can talk about those numbers intelligently and answer questions which are more than just what are the numbers. So sort of evolve from the what to the why, because the why is the really, really interesting part in all of this. And the third, I would say, is, take the time to really get to know your board and learn them and analyze them. I mean, just as a side note, and you asked about AI earlier, one of the things that I've done, for example, is to create a version of ChatGPT, which I've trained to be my board. So I've had it analyze and research each member of my board in depth and basically created a virtual board. And before I go and I present anything to my board, I run it by my virtual board and say, okay, now please tell me, how would my board react to this collectively and individually? And it's not always right, but it is very often right. And it has provided me with very, very helpful insights into what to expect in terms of challenges and pushbacks.
I love that idea. I've had a go at getting ChatGPT to create a virtual version of me to ask all sorts of questions. I love that idea of a virtual version of the board. And I must admit that one of the things that I frequently use is I've got an imaginary board in the back of my mind that quite often it's people that I respect or have mentored me and things like that that,
Mm.
I'll kind of have a conversation in my mind with individuals on there and get their responses to things. Now,
So
you're
that was
making me wonder about, is that something you could do in AI? That could be
so
fun.
I've done that as well. Actually, I've created an advisory board, a virtual advisory board. So I basically had ChatGPT research and suggest 10 people that I should, if I had all of the options in the world, 10 people that I would put on the advisory board for ApprovalMax. And it came up with a much longer list. And together we cut it down to 10 people. And then I've had it research in depth those 10 people, everything they ever wrote, published, spoke, everything, right? And then I use that advisory board separately to my actual board to run ideas by them. And obviously, these are people that, in some cases I would never have access to because they're very, influential, busy people that won't give me the time of day. So I get a virtual version of them. Super helpful.
It's fantastic. Got one question coming in from, it's actually an anonymous attender. What tools do you use for calendar control? Are you using a specific tool that's helping you block peak time in your calendar?
I am, and if you bear with me a minute, I will dig up the name of that specific tool because the name escapes me right now. But bear
I,
with me one
I did
second, and I'll tell
trial
you.
myself with a reasonable amount of success called Reclaim.ai.
Exactly that.
It's that one. Brilliant. Yes.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And it's very useful. It allows you to program it to basically carve out times for lunch and focus time and stuff like that. And it allows you to integrate multiple calendars. So it's a very useful piece of
And it
software.
also has a meeting booking facility in it as well, as I remember.
True.
Yeah.
Correct.
For meeting bookings, I use Calendly all the time, and it's a
We do as an organization as well, and I think it's better than Reclaim, but it doesn't have the other features that Reclaim has.
yeah. Amit's asking a question. As a first-time FD, what are the top three things to get right before thinking about maturing the board CFO relationship? Imagine a new FD in their first two or three board meetings.
Mm. I think, I mean, the first one is probably going to be obvious, which is the numbers have to be rock solid. So the numbers must always match. So the first thing is just, basic hygiene. Make sure that any number you produce, any number you deliver, any number you communicate has been triple checked and vetted. So there are never any mistakes. One. The other is, again, as an FD, and I'm assuming kind of the sort of a more traditional definition is an FD versus a CFO. You'd be looked to more to cover things like compliance and reporting rather than more sort of a strategy and forward-looking analysis. So I'd also make sure that those aspects are very clearly sort of buttoned down, and that the board is comfortable that there are no risks from a sort of a compliance point of view that are not addressed. So they need to get comfortable. And then the third thing is start pushing into FP&A, because at the end of the day, FP&A is what bridges the pathway from FD to CFO.
Good answer. Yeah, I think FP&A is a really good area to get into. Understand those numbers, understand the stories behind those numbers, the trends and everything like that. But
Astrology.
yeah, indeed, indeed. Go out there, polish your crystal ball, folks.
Exactly
Dan,
that.
thank you. Thank you hugely. I've just looked at the clock and realized we're up at the top of the hour. That has been
My
an
pleasure.
absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm sure we could go on for another hour chatting about some of this stuff, but that was fantastic. Thank you hugely for being the webinar guest this week.
Thank you very much for having me. It was my absolute pleasure, and I'm very much looking forward to doing it again in the future. And
Indeed.
thank you, everyone, for attending.
Okay. Right. Thank you, folks. Goodbye.
Bye bye.